The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Gathered on the hillside with the disciples, Jesus began to teach them, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks the door will be opened. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asks for bread, will give a stone? Or if the child asks for a fish, will you give a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? In everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets." The Gospel of the Lord. The theme of our readings is prayer, and in the first reading from Esther, we have the situation where Esther has been conscripted into a pagan culture as queen of a pagan king, Xerxes. And she finds herself now in a desperate situation because in the royal court there is intrigue. The second in command, by the name of Haman, has been slighted by Esther's older cousin, Mordecai. Mordecai would refuse to bow down to anyone but God, and Haman wanted him to bow down to himself. And so Haman, now in second in command, convinces the king to give him authority over all the Jews. And the king foolishly does, and the first decision Haman makes is to have all the Jews destroyed and all of their lands conscripted and given over to the pagans. Now, this information is made known to Esther by means of Mordecai. Esther has a real problem because one of the rules of the royal court is that you cannot approach the king, even if you're queen, unless you've been summoned. If you do without being summoned, and the king does not extend his hand to you, the scepter, you are executed. Capital offense. And Esther has not been called to the king for 30 days. She fears she has fallen out of favor with the king. And so for her to approach the king now, without being summoned, would be a real risk. But Mordecai insists, and this is what Mordecai says in Esther chapter 4. "For if you remain silent at this time, deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place, but you and your family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this." In other words, Mordecai is telling the queen, God's providence is at work, even in this very difficult situation. This is where we get the first reading, because Esther falls on her face before the Lord and asks for courage. She fasts for 3 days, and we hear her prayer. Notice the prayer is one of abandonment. She knows she's powerless. She's taking her life in her hands by approaching the king. And so she simply relies on God's mercy and remembrance. Remembrance is at the heart of this prayer. She says, "Remember, O Lord, make yourself known in this time of our affliction, and give me courage, O King of the gods and Master of all the dominion." This notion of remembrance is important in the Old Testament because it's linked to the covenant, especially the covenant God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So you often find prayers of future leaders saying, "God, remember your promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, your covenant that you would never fail in protecting them." For example, and this goes way back into the book of Genesis, when they had the flood, right at the dead center of that event, you have this important verse, "And God remembered Noah." That was the turning point. The flood receded from that point onward. Noah was rescued because God remembered his covenant. Well, that's what Esther is relying upon. That's what we rely upon as well. When we come to Mass, The whole structure of the Mass is based on remembrance. We remember the cross, and it's represented to us here so that we would never forget God's loving mercy toward us. So in the second Eucharistic prayer, which we will hear today, this is what it says. Therefore, as we celebrate the memorial of his death and resurrection, so we're remembering back to the time that Jesus gave up his life. And then it says, this is our prayer. Remember, Lord, your church spread throughout the world and bring her to the fullness of charity. And then later, remember also our brothers and sisters who have fallen asleep in the hope of the resurrection and all who have died in your mercy. So this remembrance is very important. It's linked to the covenant, and in our prayers, especially when we're fearful or we're stressed because of all that's going on in the world, let's remember God's covenant of love, how he's always been faithful to his people and he will be faithful to us. So in confidence, especially when we're in time of stress like Esther was, let us humble ourselves, remember God's covenant, and then go forward and act with our own mercy. That's why Jesus says in today's gospel, ask, it will be given to you. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened. God is actually pleading with us to approach him as a covenant, faithful God. And then in that, he will answer our prayers, as it says, he will give us the Holy Spirit. However else our prayers may or may not have been answered the way we want, he will give us the Holy Spirit. And that is his love.